Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the endocrine system, where we're going to look at glands such as the pineal gland, the thyroid, the parathyroid, as well as the ovaries and the testes through this video. And then in the third video, we'll check out the adrenal gland and the pancreas. And so we'll kind of divide this up a little bit more for you guys so it's a little bit more manageable for you. Here we're looking at the pineal gland. We know that the pineal gland is located here on the posterior side within the brain, right back here. Right, so just as a refresher, this is the thalamus. This is the hypothalamus. We were just here with the pituitary gland. And here is the midbrain. Right here, this is the corpora quadrimedia with its superior colliculus and its inferior colliculus, and sitting right back here is that little old pineal gland. The primary focus or the primary function of that pineal gland is the release of melatonin, which is a derivative of serotonin. And it's melatonin that is responsible for creating and maintaining sleep patterns, what we refer to as circadian rhythms. And so at night, the pineal gland, through their pineal sites, secrete higher levels of melatonin, and that is what induces sleepiness. Now, what's stimulating those pineal sites, which is again another one of those neuroendocrine glands, what's stimulating those pineal sites is the increase in darkness. So as night begins to fall, the pineal gland is activated to secrete more levels of melatonin, which induces sleepiness. This is why during the fall and winter, when it gets dark by like 4:30, 5 o'clock, by 6 o'clock you feel like it's like 1 o'clock in the morning and you're ready for bed. But during the summer, when it's light out until 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, you're up and you're ready to go, and you can literally stay up much later. You don't get that sleep-induced feeling until much later in the evening because it's daylight longer. And so the levels of light and dark does play a major regulatory role in that release of melatonin. In non-human type animals, melatonin is actually also thought to regulate reproductive cycles. Right? So it actually lowers reproductive urges in other animals that experience what we call an estrus cycle or a breeding season. So what regulates things like deer and other animals to go ahead and reproduce during the fall is, again, due to the rise in melatonin levels. So the earlier it gets dark, the higher the levels of melatonin reach. That actually can go ahead and stimulate reproductive behavior. And then during the spring, when daylight starts to take over more and there's less dark, those levels of melatonin will fall. And that will actually inhibit reproductive behavior within those animals that experience estrus cycles or have those defined breeding seasons. One of the other things we know is that the pineal gland is about 75% larger in children, and it shrinks as you get older. By the time you are a teenager, all right, you've lost almost 60% or so, 75% of the total mass of the pineal gland, which might account for why children sleep so much more than teenagers, and teenagers sleep more than adults, because as we age, the size of the pineal gland is reduced. We don't quite know what exactly regulates that. We think it has something to do with regulatory effects within the reproductive cycle and the onset of puberty. So some kind of evolved mechanism from what we see within other animals that experience estrus cycles. But we're not sure. The jury is still out on that aspect of the pineal gland. The thyroid gland is the largest gland of all of the endocrine glands, and even by that notion, it does hold that title rightfully. It's one of the few glands that does not shrink over time, and so it maintains a fairly steady size. There is some shrinkage in females once they've hit menopause. We know that the main hormones that the thyroid gland is secreting is T3 and T4, and that is within the follicular cells that are surrounding the follicles. We also know that calcitonin is secreted from within the thyroid gland, and that is happening within the C cells, or those parafollicular cells. But your thyroid is a major regulator of metabolism. Right? And so it helps to increase the metabolism through an increased rate of T3 and T4, which increases oxygen consumption, increases heart rate, increases heat production, raises respiratory rates, stimulates the appetite, increased carb and fat intake, and carb, fat, and protein breakdown, promotes growth hormone production and release, and so we see major metabolic regulation happening within the thyroid gland. All right. The thyroid gland will also play a major role in fetal development in the production of the nervous and the skeletal systems. And again, those parafollicular cells that you see in between the follicles are responsible for the release of calcitonin, which is going to regulate osteoblast activity, or bone remodeling, the laying down of new bone. T4 and T3 levels that are circulating within the blood, if they are low, that will stimulate the hypothalamus to release TRH, which will then stimulate the pituitary gland to release TSH. But elevated levels of T3, specifically, within the blood, will inhibit the release of TRH, which will then inhibit the release of TSH. And so the negative feedback mechanism that we see here is specifically with, again, low levels of T4 and T3 will stimulate the release of TRH and TSH, while elevated levels of T3 only will go ahead and inhibit TRH from being secreted from the hypothalamus, and TSH being secreted from within the pituitary gland. Parathyroid. Again, not much here to add. We know that the parathyroid is actually made up of 4 small ovular glands. That is on the posterior side of the thyroid. We know that parathyroid hormone, which is the main hormone that is secreted from within the parathyroid, is a major regulator of osteoclast activity, or bone remodeling from the perspective of breaking down the bone. But the parathyroid and parathyroid hormone also regulates calcium and magnesium reabsorption, right, through, again, parathyroid hormone. So the parathyroid hormone is acting on that distal convoluted tubule to go ahead and reabsorb calcium and magnesium. And the other thing is hydrogen phosphates are also reabsorbed. Hydrogen phosphates help in bone remineralization, and so laying down new bone. Again, calcium is the same way, magnesium is the same way. I will say that parathyroid hormone affects urine production from the reabsorption of calcium and magnesium. But parathyroid hormone will also regulate the small intestines reabsorbing calcium, magnesium, and hydrogen phosphates as well. And again, this here is just showing where those small little glands are located there on the back of the thyroid. So this here is the thyroid that you're looking at right there, and then oval 1, 2, 3, and 4. These guys little right here are the parathyroid. And then really the last two things I wanted to touch on here was the gonadal hormones. Ovaries produce several hormones. You should be familiar with estrogen and progesterone. But inhibin is another hormone that is secreted within the ovaries. Inhibin inhibits follicle stimulating hormone. So if during pregnancy you don't want to go ahead and start wasting eggs and having those eggs continue to mature, inhibin is released at a higher level, which shuts down follicle stimulating hormone. And then relaxin is another hormone that actually helps the cartilage, the fibrocartilage within the pubis symphysis to go ahead and relax. And that gives the pelvis more flexibility during the birthing process. And it also aids in cervical dilation. And lastly, the testis, which produces two main hormones, testosterone and inhibin. Again, testosterone, which is really a key hormone in the production and the driving force of sperm production. And then inhibin is going to inhibit follicle stimulating hormone, which will then stop the release of testosterone or slow it down, lower it, so that way you're not producing as much sperm. That is possibly might not be needed. And so that was a very quick, brief look at those glands there. Again, a lot of that stuff was already covered, or at least the hormone action was already covered within the lab. I just wanted to make sure that it was mentioned here. I know that was a shorter video, and that's okay. The third video will probably be about the same length. And so on that note, I'll give you some time to go back and review your notes, make sure you've got everything jotted down, and I'll catch you on the other side.